starting on time.
Please go ahead.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to everybody who's joining us from around the world for this really exciting and promising panel discussion as part of ERF's 28th annual conference. This is the second plenary session. Those of us who attend these annual events organized by ERF regularly know that the plenary sessions are the icing on the cake. We had one such icing like this yesterday with Professor Carmen Reichardt, who teased us with a rather challenging, if not depressing, state of the world economy affairs with the multiple shocks affecting different economies in a very relatively short period of time. The climate crisis multiplied by those of the COVID, and of course now recently war at the heart of Europe with severe global implications. As the discussions yesterday were focused on the current conjuncture, today we get a chance to actually look beyond at longer term strategic issues and challenges that affect the developing world, emerging economies. The topic for today is, in fact, macroeconomics of development policies beyond the crisis. I could not think of somebody better to address us on this topic than the renowned Professor Danny Roderick from Harvard. He has been a friend of the ERF over the years since its inception, and it's a great pleasure to have him back this year to address us with a keynote speech. I know everyone wants to hear to his presentation and listen to his latest messages. He's one of those extremely fertile, not only renowned professional economists, academic economists, but also public intellectuals who operate at the frontier of knowledge. And not only that, he's one of the few who's actually constantly pushing beyond the frontiers and keeps us on our toes by raising important questions. And in a sense, as someone who's been teaching economics for development economics and political economy for some years, for me, he's sort of the conscience of our profession. He covers an extremely wide range of topics, given his intellectual agility, the sharpness of his pen, or maybe I should say his keyboard and mouse. If you look at some of his commentaries, for instance, on Project Syndicate site, where he has a very active profile, the range of topics he covers is truly impressive. For those of us economists who are a little bit infatuated with metrics, I had a quick look at his Google Scholar, and I wasn't surprised at all to find him amongst the top 10 most highly cited economists worldwide, with the likes of Paul Samuelson, for instance. And if you look at social sciences, he's actually the top one. But beyond the numbers and the metrics, it's the influence. He is truly one of the exemplary influencers before the idea of an influencer became rather popularized on social media, because he makes impact. And his expertise in international political economy, development economics, and his signature area, his signature work in areas of globalization, trade, and of course, industrial policy, as I said, is coupled with an immense array of other topics where he truly blends rigor with relevance. So let me just very briefly say a few things about this panel. We have another 3 renowned panelists. I will introduce them when the time comes. We will have Danny address us on the future of development strategy for about 20 minutes. Then I will do short introductions to our discussants, and they will then each address us for about 7 to 10 minutes. Danny will then have a chance to respond, and we very much hope to have an opportunity to receive comments and questions from the floor. You can post your questions in the Q&A area, which you will see at the bottom of the Zoom screen after 2 years intense usage of online webinars. I think everybody's familiar with these buttons. There's also another button on the right-hand side bottom of the screen, which says interpretation. If anybody requires Arabic simultaneous translation, that is also provided today. So very briefly, Professor Danny Roderick is Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard, at the Kennedy School in Harvard. He's published very widely in the areas of economic development and international economics and political economy, as I mentioned earlier. His current research focuses on employment and economic growth in both developing and advanced nations. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including the inaugural Albert O. Hirschman Prize of the SSRC and the Princess of Austria's Award for Social Sciences. He is currently president of the International Economic Association and co-director of the Reimagining the Economy program at Harvard's Kennedy School. He has authored and edited numerous books, and I just mentioned the latest one, which was published in 2021 with the title of Combating Inequality, Rethinking Government's Role. Okay, without further ado, Professor Danny Roderick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Hakimian, for that extraordinarily generous introduction. After what you've said, I think there's no way that possibly I would not let this audience down with what I'm about to say, but I really don't have a choice but to continue. So I really appreciate those very kind words, and I really look forward also to the discussion that we're going to have after my remarks with this very distinguished panel. So I look forward to that. I'm going to try to share my screen and get this into presentation mode. And switch views, and now hopefully you see the cover slide of my presentation. So we're obviously going through a period of transition in the world economy that one gets the feeling that nothing will be quite the same afterwards, and it's not just the pandemic, of course, that continues to have its impact felt. It's the war in Ukraine, and it's the ongoing geopolitical competition and tensions between China and the United States. There is talk of deglobalization, of the context of the world economy changing, with concerns about national security becoming much more dominant than the issues of economics and economic development, and many of the gains that were made in poverty reduction and global development in the last 3-4 decades, much of which was concentrated in East Asia, but still other parts of the world benefited as well. Many of these gains potentially being reversed. But there is a sense in which these somewhat sudden, perhaps unexpected shocks, the pandemic, the war, are only reinforcing underlying structural trends that I think have at least convinced me for some time that the overall context for economic development is fundamentally altered, and that we need to think about the future of development strategy in a somewhat different way. many of the issues that I'm going to be talking about, I think, are going to be very familiar to a Middle Eastern audience, because the question about jobs, about employment creation, about finding ways of overcoming dualism, these are, of course, endemic issues in the context of Middle Eastern economies. And in some ways, these are not novel issues, but I think what has been happening to the possibilities for devising alternative development strategies and the constraints that we now have on those mean that sort of how we think about possible remedies has potentially changed. So we have a traditional way of thinking about development and structural change when we talk about development strategy. That is represented in this diagram, that we divide up the economy into three different sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, services, and then distinguish between informal activities with low productivity and then organized formal activities that operate closer to the global productivity frontier. That successful development essentially entails moving resources and primarily labor from informal, low productivity agriculture first into sort of more organized, formal, higher productivity manufacturing. And of course, that is the process of industrialization. And late in the development process, a kind of moving further into high productivity services. So this is the traditional path that all of today's advanced countries essentially have taken. And when we think about development strategy, it usually consists of how do we push this process along? How do we remove obstacles to this, in particular, moving resources into urban, higher productivity industries and associated services. What is happening today in the developing world, including countries that prior to the pandemic were growing rapidly, is something very, very different. In one respect, the situation is similar in that resources are still leaving agriculture. That is that workers are still flocking into urban areas. But the composition of economic activities, which is absorbing this urban influx, is very, very different. There is very little formal industrialization that is taking place, even in very low-income countries that might have benefited from China moving up the value chain and leaving many traditional labor-intensive manufacturers up for grabs. And that the bulk of the workers that go into urban areas is being absorbed by relatively unproductive petty services organized sort of informally. And so there's a combination of a process of what I've called premature deindustrialization in middle-income countries, to the extent that industrialization does proceed as it has in some low-income countries, that there is still a dominance of informality within manufacturing, so that the progress with manufacturing actually looks very deceiving, because the bulk of manufacturing that absorbs employment is not higher productivity organized factories, but it's much more sort of smaller scale, low productivity, informal manufacturing with much poorer productivity prospects. And of course, in many countries, that includes many countries in the Middle Eastern region as well, that this situation is aggravated by the very low employment absorption capacity of natural resource sectors that might be the source of significant rents. That is the fundamental issue that this overall picture presents for us, is the big overarching question of where will the more productive formal sector jobs be created? And the answer to this question traditionally was in manufacturing, particularly in export-oriented or globally competitive manufacturing. And increasingly, this path looks less and less feasible for reasons that I'll come back to in a second. But let's look at some of the countries that in fact have been most successful with industrialization. These are not countries that are relatively rich. The countries in the lower panel are mostly still middle-income countries. But what's striking when one looks at what is happening with manufacturing in these countries is that even in countries where the share of manufacturing output has remained stable or in fact has actually increased, the share of employment always has continued to decline. So there is a process of employment deindustrialization that is extremely common around the world. Look at South Korea in this picture, which is really amazing. That's the country that's sort of the second one on the top row. If you look at the share of manufacturing value added at constant prices, it actually has continued to increase and then sort of stabilized after the 2010s. But the share of employment has continued to essentially fall and is now much lower. There's virtually no country in the world that in recent years has managed to engineer sort of sustainable increase in employment in manufacturing, regardless of income levels. And I think the fundamental reason that's driving this is a pattern of global technological change, which has turned manufacturing into increasingly a much more skill-intensive, much more capital-intensive kind of activity. So if we look around the world and with the type of employment that is absorbed into manufacturing, this is I think for a group of 15, 20 countries around the world, disaggregating labor use in manufacturing by type of skill, you can see that while intermediate and high skill employment has roughly maintained its share in employment in manufacturing, it's really the low skill share that has really fallen. So the pattern of technological change has been especially biased against low skill labor. And why is that important? Well, that's important because the patterns of technologies, the technologies that are absorbed by developing countries in order to be able to compete on global markets is essentially also becoming increasingly biased against low-skilled labor, which is precisely the resource that developing countries have in abundance. We can see this, for example, in the patterns of labor use in global value chains, that global value chains being essentially the primary vehicle through which advanced technologies are transferred to developing countries. You can see the blue line is the use of highly educated labor. The red curve is for low educated labor. You can see a significant decline in the use of low educated or relatively less skilled labor in the use of global value chains. So if the developing countries are being faced with a global context where technology is increasingly skill intensive, increasingly capital intensive, then essentially firms in developing countries face the following kind of a dilemma. Without going into the analytics in much greater detail, the dilemma that a firm faces in manufacturing in a developing country is essentially either they produce behind some natural protection and purely for the home market, relatively low quality goods, and then they can absorb a lot of labor. So the smaller and medium-sized enterprises primarily serving the domestic market, producing relatively low quality manufacturers behind some walls of actual or natural protection. Those can use those can produce goods with relatively traditional labor-intensive technologies, and they can absorb labor. But the firms that want to compete globally and therefore have to produce with technologies that are similar to those that exist in global competitors have to essentially adopt highly skilled and capital-intensive technologies, which in fundamentally are very inappropriate to the factor endowments of these countries, which are primarily rich in low-skilled labor. So I think what that means is that there's a kind of a triple whammy that the formal manufacturing employment experience is a result of this stark technological predicament. That there's first a kind of a direct employment loss in manufacturing, particularly in formal manufacturing in developing countries. That is essentially due to a reduction in comparative advantage, because if global technological change is biased to be labor saving, that fundamentally moves technological comparative advantage away from labor abundant countries. And as the output and exports of labor abundant countries, low income countries fall, employment falls correspondingly. But there's a kind of a second round effect, which is that the employment implications of this loss in comparative advantage are magnified by the fact that whatever employment survives in the formal parts of manufacturing, those that are more globally integrated, that's a lot less labor intensive, that uses a lot less low skilled labor. So there's an additional employment loss due to the shift in production technique or the kind of technologies that are in use. And third, there's a kind of a more dynamic effect that arises that from the fact that the employment elasticity to positive profitability shocks is reduced. That is to say, if you do everything right in your economy, you get governance right, you increase profitability in formal, globally integrated parts of your economy, the ability of employment to respond positively is reduced because of the relative scarcity of complementary inputs in the domestic economy, because these are sectors that are demanding in terms of physical capital, in terms of skills, in terms of infrastructure. So the cost curve is much more steeply shaped for these formal manufacturing firms than was the case with the earlier wave of export-oriented industrializing countries, as in the East Asian cases. So I think this is a kind of a set of questions and worries that I think have convinced me that the regular industrialization path to economic growth and development has now become much weaker compared to the experience of basically all the countries since the Industrial Revolution that have experienced modern economic growth. So the question that raises is sort of, what is the alternative? What is if we're going to be moving away from the traditional model of industrialization-driven growth, what are there alternatives? Now, to evaluate alternatives, I think we need to be very upfront about what was actually special about manufacturing industries. I think manufacturing industries traditionally have been special as a growth driver for three reasons. One is that it's relatively easy to copy advanced technologies in manufacturing. So the productivity dynamics have been special compared to traditional agriculture or many services where the intangible elements and the locally contextual elements make it much harder to transfer technology. So one thing is that being able to copy advanced technologies has been easier. The second is precisely because traditionally manufacturing has been labor intensive, it has had a very high capacity to absorb labor. So there have been few constraints on the supply side that you could shift a lot of farmers and peasants, unskilled workers into manufacturing, essentially having few constraints on the supply side. And the third, there were few constraints on the demand side for the expansion of these manufacturing industries as well, because manufacturing was a tradable industry. So you could produce for global markets. You were not constrained by the size of the home market, which in turn, of course, depends on productivity of everything else. And therefore, you could have these manufacturing industries expand rather quickly without running into the constraints of a limited market size. Now, of course, what has happened now with the story that I've given you is that basically the second of these factors no longer occurs, and that's why sort of manufacturing doesn't do its job anymore. So in terms of agriculture, in terms of alternatives, then we have to ask the question: can we replicate these features in different parts of the economy? And here I think we sort of run into some problems. So with respect to agriculture, I think there's no question that there remain significant productivity gains that are still possible in traditional agriculture. And there's clearly in a lot of countries, this is not necessarily true in a lot of Middle Eastern countries that don't have a lot of workers in the countryside or don't have very large agricultural sectors. But for many other low-income countries, I think the potential for increasing productivity, both in traditional and non-traditional agriculture, is quite high. Having said that, it's also the case that it's very difficult to imagine agriculture as a labor or employment absorbing sector. Because in fact, the more successful you're going to be with productivity enhancement, the more likely that agriculture will be releasing employment to the rest of the economy. And if that is so, agriculture cannot be the solution to this conundrum, because agriculture, even in the best of possible circumstances, will be a sector that is releasing workers, that is releasing employment. And therefore, the question still becomes, where will those workers go? They will go into services in the urban areas. And services, loosely speaking, really come in two types. Now, there's a variety of services that are both high productivity and tradable, such as IT, business services, call centers, cultural services, movies, films, videos, software, which have some of the elements of this endogenous productivity trajectory and so forth, and tradability that manufacturing traditionally has had. But the problem is that they are, for most countries, they're actually very skill intensive. So you can imagine building a much bigger IT sector in Jordan or in Turkey, but in these countries, there's still a very large mismatch between the skill composition of the workforce and the skill requirements of these IT sectors. And so the question is, since you cannot improve the skills and education levels of all your labor force all at once, you still need some way of transitioning into that longer state. And of course, then by default, what happens is that employment gets absorbed into these low productivity, mostly non-tradable services. And because these serve the home market, they simply cannot act as growth leaders, as growth poles in quite the same way as particular tradable services can do. So this is really why I think the growth ceiling on the developing world has been fundamentally lowered by this global transformation in technologies, and by the fact that industrialization's potential as a potent driver of economic growth has been significantly blunted as a result. So I return to the question that I had posed, which is, I think the fundamental question facing development strategy now becomes, where will the good jobs come from? And of course, good jobs are productive jobs. We cannot create good jobs without creating productive employment. These were traditionally spearheaded by manufacturing. And I think much greater role will have to be played in the future in creating good jobs, mostly in sort of domestic services. And this is where I think there is this joining of social policy with growth policy, because when you think about the implications of this, ultimately growth policy and social policy begin to overlap to a much greater degree, which is that you cannot have in this new setting, because you cannot focus on particular leading sectors, neither your natural resource sectors nor your manufacturing, that's plugged into global value chains, is absorbing sufficient employment. Then you really, the only way you can have growth is ensuring that a larger number of workers are partaking of higher productivity employment. And that means expanding the middle class. So growth requires expanding the middle class. On the other hand, you really cannot address the structural factors behind poverty and inequality without creating good productive jobs for those relatively low-skilled workers in your economy. So social inclusion and poverty reduction requires creation of good jobs, which is exactly what growth requires as well. But creating good jobs requires then creating good firms that will employ these workers. So good jobs also requires good firms. And I think what that means is that in terms of the policy implications of looking at the problem from this perspective, what it requires is a kind of a set of interventions on both the supply and the demand sides of labor market. So on the one hand, investments in education and training and skilling, which is tightly geared towards the needs of the productive segments of the economy, the firms, but also targeting firms directly to the expansion, multiplication, and stimulation of more good firms, but firms that are in a somewhat different segment of the economy than in the kind of traditional industrial policy that tends to focus on large firms, national champions, globally competitive firms. And the industrial policy here would tend to focus much more on a kind of a middle segment, smaller and medium-sized enterprises, firms that are mainly in services and selling in the home market. So I think in terms of reconsidering development policy, I think I use this broad matrix in terms of configuration of policies that devise our interventions into different stages of the economy, and the traditional poverty reduction and social protection model is essentially kinds of investments in endowments, that is in education and training, together with some post-production interventions and cash transfers and full employment macro policies, some social safety nets. So that's the traditional social protection model. Then the traditional growth model is really focuses much more on the sort of the high end of the economy, improving productivity in the mostly global integrated parts of the economy, and the kind of considerations I've laid out here really are much more go into the kind of the center cell of this matrix that is focusing on not the sort of the commanding heights of the economy or the most productive parts of the economy, but sort of focusing on the middle productivity segments and trying to raise them up, and that's going to be largely having to deal with smaller and medium-sized enterprises, focusing on this both demand and supply side of labor markets, as I was saying before. That's sort of going to require thinking about these new types of industrial policies that are actually very, very different from our image of East Asian industrial policies with hard conditionality and export orientation and dealing with large firms, and so much more of a kind of a framework of providing a set of support services to firms, whether it's marketing, whether it's business assistance, whether it's technological help, whether it's help with business plans, trying to figure out which firms are more entrepreneurial than others, trying to sort of create incentives for the more entrepreneurial, dynamic small firms to self-select into these incentive regimes in return for soft conditionality that they would undertake requisite investments in productivity increases and also employment generation. So there would be kind of this loose quid pro quo. So this takes us very in a different direction, I believe, than what our traditional industrial policies have been. And we have little evidence on the efficacy of such policies. But this is sort of where this kind of thinking takes me and probably raises a lot of questions, as much more questions than in fact it answers. But I'm quite frankly sort of struggling with this broad question of where will the good jobs come from. So with that, let me just stop here and turn it over to you, Professor Akemian.
Well, thank you very much for that really illuminating and stimulating thoughts. I guess we all agree that the quest for finding the right answers requires, as a starting point, asking the right questions. And you've certainly given us plenty of food for thought. So let us, without further ado, proceed with our discussants. And I would like to ask Dr. Ibrahim Al-Badawi to follow very briefly. He doesn't really need any introduction. You can see my job is very pleasant and simple today. He is the managing director of ERF, of course, our boss in this forum. He was a Minister of Finance and Economic Planning for the Republic of Sudan for a brief period, just under a year, 2019-20. And also appointed by the UN Secretary General to the High-Level Advisory Board on Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations in December 2020. Before joining ERF in Cairo, Dr. Al-Badawi was at the Dubai Economic Council for a fairly long period, 2009 to 2016, and also a lead economist at the Development Research Group of the World Bank. He has a lot of publications. His publications can easily be referenced on the ERF website. And without further ado, I ask Ibrahim to offer us his thoughts, please. You are muted. You are still muted. We can see the PowerPoint, but can't hear you because you're muted. I think you need to. Excellent.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, very well. Please go ahead.
And you can see the screen? Okay. You can see my screen, right?
We can. Very well. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much, and many thanks for the kind introduction. So this is my few comments on the most interesting Danny's presentation. I will start by saying that in just 17 slides, I think Danny gave us a succinct, informative tour de force of the knowledge and practice of development policy. Specifically, he told us where we stand and where we are going, or at least where we should be heading. I would like to offer a selective commentary on three issues. One of the fundamental conclusions about growth policy and social policy being inseparable. And I would like to highlight the case study of Morocco, drawing from one of my colleagues from the IMF recent presentation on the experience of Morocco in the area of export diversification based on integration into global value chain. And then I asked a question about, in a world of digitech and global value chains, is real exchange rate-led export promotion strategy a passé, or is it still relevant? And then the last one I wanted to speak to very quickly is agriculture, specifically how to make agriculture look like industry, especially from the perspective of the high productivity or at least if not unconditional convergence. And then I would like to draw some ideas for future direction of ERF research from Danny's excellent presentation. Let me try to get rid of this. Yes. So in terms of the growth policy and social policy being inseparable, the case of Morocco is a success story in terms of integration into global value chains. And this slide belongs actually to Roberto Cardarelli from the IMF, in which he actually noted that Morocco's industrial acceleration plan of 2014 identified integration of global value chain into domestic economy as one of the key objectives, as well as job creation and increasing domestic value added content in exports. And this integration took the form of high-tech global value chain, such as automotives and aerospace. And the instruments used were incentives, export processing zones, and free trade agreements with the EU and the US. And as you can see, both forward integration and backward integration into global value chain over the years have risen significantly, especially backward integration into global value chain, which suggests that Morocco has made considerable inroads in terms of the complexity and sophistication of its exports, which actually accounted for 40% of Morocco's exports. Now, however, integration into global value chains failed to produce economy-wide structural transformation, such as in terms of real GDP growth, or in terms of significant improvement of the current account indicators, or even more importantly, in terms of creating jobs and generating higher employment rates. So as you can see then, this is a case in point where economic diversification through global value chain did not actually translate into an economy-wide structural transformation, achieving the ultimate development objectives of creating jobs and igniting or sustaining growth. So clearly this, I think, in coherence with Danny's analysis, that a new development model for scaling up the benefits of global value chain based economic diversification is needed. For example, investing in education and training, as Danny's recommend, and you can see here the red line is where Morocco is. So it's very clear that in terms of education and training, there is a lot to be done. And then the other thing is a new type of industrial policy, as Danny recommends, collaborative and innovative relationship with friends. You can see that actually the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, account for a significant share of the economic activities, including, for example, ICT, transport and storage, trade, and chemical manufacturing, as well as other manufacturing, as well as the overall manufacturing activities. So this is a situation where the very limited space is available, has been available to the private sector. So I'm just citing this, and I think the case of Morocco, which seemed to be relatively a successful case of global value chain-based economic diversification, did not generate the intended results of the strategy. The second question is in a world of digitech and global value chain. Is real exchange rate-led export promotion per se? This is actually a research project I'm working on with two colleagues, Shahir Zaki from the Cairo University and Suha Ismail from the Egyptian Ministry of Finance, where we are looking at the impact or the determinants of participation in global value chain, both the aggregate gross exports and the components, domestic and foreign, but it's still work in progress. So I use some literature, some estimates from the literature to make the point that actually, yes, true, when a significant component of the export value added is accounted for by the foreign value added, it tends actually to weaken or even ameliorate the negative impact of real exchange rate appreciation. But then you have to have a very substantial share of foreign value added in your aggregate exports value added in order to have a meaningful impact, such as Luxembourg, for example. But then when you are Saudi Arabia, with very small, until now, very small foreign value added share, actually appreciation is actually very bad. Even if you are in Morocco or Tunisia, still there is a far away from Luxembourg. So I would conclude from this that actually we may not anymore be able to depreciate ourselves to prosperity, as Sergey Bella in a book in 2012 or 16, I don't remember, I think 2012, he actually published a book by Peterson Institution under the title Devaluing to Prosperity. Perhaps maybe you may not be able to depreciate ourselves to prosperity anymore. Nonetheless, as I said, there is a long way from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or Tunisia or Morocco and Luxembourg. So the real exchange rate may still not yet be a passe. And in fact, I just did a quick search on the net about Danny Roderick's earlier contribution. And I found this very interesting paper testing the validity of Roderick's conclusion on real exchange rate and economic growth. And they're using machine learning techniques to actually analyze this. And they took the case of Germany, Slovak Republic, and South Africa. And at least for the case of the trade open, highly trade open economy of Slovakia, they found actually that the real exchange rate is the most important determinant of export activity. In Germany, the exchange rate is important, but it is secondary to the level of economic growth or level of development, and the same also for South Africa. So I think I would argue that for our region, before we actually get there, we need actually to, because it's a process, we need not to forget about the importance of exchange rate competitiveness. And we would like to do more research on this. The last issue is making agriculture look like industry. This is a very interesting research done by Ishaq Diwan back in 2013. And myself and Nuha Ismail, we did a study with a focus on Sudan. And in fact, the very interesting results is that there is, for agriculture, it is rather unconditional divergence rather than no divergence or no convergence. It's actually divergence. And even when you control for country-specific effects, conditional convergence is rather challenging. It's not as tight and clear-cut as in the case for the case of manufacturing. So the observation by Dani that significant productivity gains are possible in traditional agriculture, and there are possibilities in non-traditional agriculture. Clearly, is a commonplace to say that robust economy-wide horizontal policies are well honed and accepted to invest in rural human and physical capital, and to impose measured direct taxation, just like what the historical Asian state did, but then to avoid indirect taxation, especially real exchange rate overvaluation, as well as excessive inflation. However, vertical strategies for making agriculture looking like industry may be quite viable and very important to consider and to research, such as growth corridors linked with productive cities, plantations, contractual agriculture, marketing boards, and cooperatives. These are vertical, policies that have been shown to be quite important in places like Kenya, for example. There are issues associated with it that need to be addressed, but these are the kind of interventions that might be useful to consider if we are really, especially for many countries in the region where agriculture hold a lot of promise as a comparative advantage for the economies of these countries. Finally,
Dr. Ibrahim, if you don't mind, I will give you a chance to come back in the interest of time.
This is the last slide.
Very quickly, though. Very quickly, please.
Yeah. Ideas for future direction of research. Macroeconomics and political economy of full employment. This is, I think it will be important to consider this. New industrial policy, role of the state and the private sector, the good jobs agenda, export diversification, digitech, global value chain, environmental footprints, real exchange rate, and all that, especially including the servicification and the servitization of manufacturing, and the extent to which it could be extended to agriculture as well. And then, of course, making agriculture look like industry. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for spending beyond my time. Thanks.
Thank you very much. You've raised a number of very interesting and complementary questions, especially the role of industrialization in agriculture and international trade. I'm sure we'll come back to some of these. Let me introduce very briefly Dr. Mary Kawar, who is our next discussant. She's the former Jordanian Minister for Planning and International Cooperation. Prior to that, she spent 20 years with the International Labour Organization, both in Geneva and the regional office for Arab states in Beirut. She has decades of experience in government and international development across the globe, but especially focusing on the Arab region and Jordan. Her expertise is in the areas of labor, youth, gender, social protection, and refugee lives. Over to you, Dr. Kawar, please. No more than 10 minutes, if possible.
Don't worry. Thank you, Hassan. First, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this learning experience, and for Danny for this very enriching presentation. I will speak from a policy perspective in an attempt to contextualize Danny's presentation, also on the Arab region. And my references to the Arab region will actually exclude the GCC. It will be just the 9 non-oil economies. I will pick 2 of the main conclusions of Danny, which really spoke to me from my previous work experience. First is what actually Dr. Ibrahim just addressed in the case of Morocco, which is the increasingly important linkages between economic growth and social policies. And the second issue is the centrality of good jobs for any development model, not just jobs, but good jobs. So, in terms of Danny's observation that growth policies and social policy increasingly become one and the same, this is really an issue that has haunted us in the MENA region, as we tend to prioritize growth ahead of social impact of growth. Also, the history of social policy in the region is that it is segmented and scattered. It is so despite the fact that the level of public social spending on health, education, social assistance, and the like is not too low compared to other regions of the world. What we now know is that what matters is not just fast growth, but what type of growth we have. The fact that per capita incomes in the region have not been increasing, and in some countries have been declining over time, is a case in point. There are many studies that show that inequality, both in opportunities and outcomes, have been increasing in MENA region. So even if we do the right economic reforms that would lead to faster economic growth, their future sustainability will depend on the social acceptance of how the benefits of growth is being shared. Now, on the positive side, some countries have demonstrated their ability to swiftly adopt strong and innovative policy measures in response to the pandemic and focus more broadly on social policy and social protection and address issues that were previously ignored in economic policy, especially. For example, looking at informal workers, supporting working families, groups and issues that have been absent on the policy agenda previously. There is also some good examples from the region in deploying digital solutions to enhance the efficiency of social protection systems and expand coverage. Examples are Egypt and Morocco and Jordan during the COVID. And such adaptability and innovation will be critical in the coming years to leverage accelerating trends in digitalization in a way that would contribute to a fairer economy. On the second point regarding good jobs development model, which is indeed spot on for the MENA. It is also the exact point where social policy, economic policy, the rights agenda, and the need for political reform all interact. It all interacts when it comes to the good jobs agenda. The challenge of job creation in the decent work is well known in the region. I mean, the region faces long-term structural unemployment. Most countries are stuck in low-skill, low-wage cycle with a large services sector. So I think that the shift from agriculture to industry to agriculture to services skipped a point, and I think a lot of Arab countries now have a very large, unregulated, flexible services sector. This is in addition to inadequate living wage, as well as challenges related to social dialogues and labor rights. So allow me to elaborate on this point of good jobs. Now, the quality of governance in the region leaves much to be desired. I will not give specific examples, but let me ask some questions. Is it that Arab policymakers do not know what to do along the lines that Danny proposes, or do not want to do it, or cannot do it? So, granted that geopolitics are an almost defining force in the region, but not always. For example, the crisis in Lebanon has little to do with external policies. We have persistent deficits and rising government debts in many economies, and it's another example of kicking the can down the road for the future generations. From the micro perspective, one has not only to ask whether the private sector is rentier or competitive, whether to ask it is open to trade or protected, whether it encourages investments or not. The big issue is who benefits from the persisting regulatory and bureaucratic rules and how we can get them out of the way. Now, on top of the established bureaucracy in the region, we are unavoidably facing what everyone else in the world is confronted with, which is rapid technological change. In my view, this is creating a two-speed economy, and with it, a polarized labor market. We live in an era when the decline in informality has been halted, and in many countries, it has been increasing with the emergence of the gig economy. And of course, this has been aided by the pandemic's work patterns. So in a way, it is a new form of inequality with a few benefiting and a lot are left behind. The latest 2022 inequality report found that the richest 10% of the global population now captures more than 50% of total income, while the poorest half captures only 8%. So in the Arab region, we are not the only ones to face the challenge of inequality and spurred by globalization, automation, etc. And now we have to think to add to that increasing food prices. But for us in the Arab region, this comes on top of too many pre-existing conditions that makes the agenda quite heavy. It's quite a long to-do list, and we must do it all. Now, one last point that I would like to highlight is the importance of the role of, and I'll be concluding with this, Hassan, the role of international cooperation, including global and regional initiatives and frameworks. This is critical for the merging of equality and inclusion agendas with the economic growth agenda. And I do believe that multilateralism is a very influential tool, politically, financially, and technically, in enabling a transformative development strategies at the national levels, but also not for the national level, but also for a fairer universe. For example, we need to remind ourselves, for example, that while poorer countries suffer from climate change, it is actually the northern countries who are the main polluters. And that is why we cannot ignore the bigger picture of any transformative developed model. Now, in my view, international cooperation is under threat along the line of several dimensions, mounting trade wars, the increasing number of bilateral trade agreements favoring the powerful rather than the worst off. Cooperation, as actually Danny said, is motivated by security considerations rather than economics. We have the questioning of global institutions by some prominent countries, let alone the defunding of some multilateral institutions. We have stagnating aid flows, and especially in the post-COVID era, the hoarding of COVID vaccine by the North, and more recently with the Ukraine crisis, a selective approach towards the global refugee crisis. So what do these trends mean for a development policy at a national level? How can national governments respond? And what are the roles of the UN and multilaterals and bilaterals, as well as donors? I will leave this as an open question, but it's a reminder how integrated our lives are, and that a development policies is both about what we can do or what to do, as well as the degree to which we are interconnected and we need to work towards shared values. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Those are very wise words, especially from the perspective of an experienced policymaker. So let me introduce very briefly Professor Atif Kubursi, who is our last but not least discussant. Professor Kubursi is an emeritus professor of economics at McMaster University. He's taught economics previously at Purdue University and been a visiting scholar at Cambridge University, as well as at York University, where he was at the Faculty of Environment and Urban Studies. Dr. Kubursi has served as Senior Development Officer at UNIDO and also as Acting Executive Secretary and Under-Secretary General of the ASQA, United Nations ASQA. He's a familiar face in ERF circles and has been a fellow of the Economic Research Forum and chair of the board of the Global Footprint Data Foundation. Over to you. Time is ticking away. So again, if we can have no more than 10 minutes, I'm very keen to invite Danny to come back to a wide range of challenging questions now posed and to have the benefit of his repost. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan, for your generous introduction. And thank you very much, Dr. Roderick for an excellent and incisive presentation. The thesis of the presentation is very simple but very strong in the sense that now we cannot rely on industrialization to absorb increasing labor entrants, and we cannot depend on services because services itself is transforming into high-skill intensive. What do we have to look for, and what is available? To some extent, there is a general feeling that maybe we cannot depend anymore on neoclassical economics, too many market failures and underinvestment in skill formation. And we cannot depend on Keynesian economics, but maybe not. I mean, yes, Keynesian economics is too much in the short run. We're talking about the long run, and for Keynes, we're all dead in the long run. But there is no question about it, is that all this transformation, all the things that would be required to create the good productive jobs need high aggregate demand. And if this aggregate demand is not there, and if Keynesian policies are not underpinning what we do, there would be limited chances of creating an economy that would give incentive and rewards to those that would make the transition and would lead the transition. And there is the example of the Asian tigers. Yes, all the graphs that you have shown are Asian tigers, where the manufacturing value added is rising, but manufacturing employment is declining. But we cannot dismiss the example that the Asian tigers have given us about what good macroeconomic policy, high rates of savings, high rates of investments in human capital, not just physical capital, in education, in skills, the importance of taking advantage of the export market, because domestic markets are typically ultimately remain as a limited market and will present constraints on the ability to take advantage of economies of scale and scope. Equitable distribution of income and wealth, they've emphasized it. Stable governments. And for people like us in the Middle East, this means a lot. I mean, and we cannot dismiss it, cannot take it lightly. Macroeconomic stability and the extent to which we could continue to provide the conditions for competitive manufacturing. We need to regulate markets so that they operate within properly functioning social system, create markets when they did not exist, direct investment to high growth and high export sectors, create the conducive environment, reverse market inequitable outcomes, and the government to take real important role in the economy. Encourage cooperation, not necessarily only competition, and manage competition in a way that would allow the economy to make smooth and productive transitions. The story is, and I'm going to, bring in a number of factors that I'm sure are not really ways that Dr. Roderick doesn't know about and has not really been involved in looking at it. The importance of high aggregate demand, that's extremely important. And we need to really keep the economy in a situation that macroeconomic stability is not going to be lost, and that this transition can be guided in a smooth way. The industrial policy need to be different. You see, in the past, industrial policy, even with the Asian tigers, to a great extent, meant sheltering industry. At the moment, we really need, according to the arguments Professor Roderick has given us, we need to shelter the learning process, shelter the skill formation process. And there is really incredible opportunities there from the education system, from the training centers, from the incubators, from the accelerators. There are many avenues where the government can and is able to do things that will create the better jobs, the high productive jobs. And there are new jobs that we did not have in the past and can really work within them. We have to also emphasize, and probably Professor Roderick did not mention it directly, it is implied, we need to create a share economy. I mean, if the jobs are not there in multitude, why can't we really work 4 days instead of 5 or 6 days? Why can't we take advantage of opportunities that a shared economy would allow us to distribute wealth and to share wealth and to generate it in common without having to tolerate incredible levels of unemployment. And then new areas. I mean, I like to tender, we're talking about agriculture. I like to talk about the green economy, a much larger one, about cleaning the environment, about preparing ourselves in terms of adaptation and mitigation and getting the new jobs in cleaning the environment, in making sure we preserve this natural capital, preserve this world, and do not threaten its existence in a way that climate change is likely to look at this. There is also the aspect here that is quite important too, and this is the argument which I very much subscribe to, is that you cannot anymore talk about economic policy independent of social policy. The two are one and the same. But there is also another thing. To a great extent, the crisis that had buffeted our economies and societies, whether it's the pandemic, whether it is the climate change, whether it's the war and things, this is bringing in a very clear message. We economists have not been willing to be as modest as we should be, the extent to which now we cannot deal with these things as economists. We have to deal with them as climatologists, as climate scientists. We have to look at the health system. I mean, what kind of a world we really live in which our vaccine rate was 80% in Canada and higher of the population were vaccinated, when only 2% in some areas of the world have only been receiving the vaccine. I mean, there are incredible, not just domestic share policies, we need a global share policy. And the issues that we are facing now are such in a way in which these crises have uncovered incredible inequities. And we face a challenge of not dealing with our macroeconomics purely on the domestic national economies. There is now an opportunity and maybe a challenge and maybe a responsibility that we tend to dismiss, but it is quite important to see to what extent this is not a national or policy makers at the national level, but it's also an international dimension to this that we should really take into account. And for economists to be willing and modest enough to recognize that we have limits and we have constraints, and that most of these complex questions are not only for our field and our economists, but it is for us working together with scientists, with health workers, with the social system, with the environmental system. The three are one and the same, not only social policy, but environmental policy, but also equitable policy on international level. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that cogent statement. You actually saved us a few minutes, which is much appreciated. This has been a very rich exchange. The number of challenges for us to face and to address has increased in a progressive way. I think Professor Roderick's presentation was deliberately focused on transformational challenges we have in the job market, focus on skills and techniques. He, I think, deliberately stayed away from challenges to do with international trade and exports, from environment, and I would add to that list also demographics. So let me invite Danny to come back and respond to maybe a few selection of some of the comments made. Obviously, we are time constrained. I have promised Danny that we would end this session at 4:30 Cairo time because he has to attend another meeting. We have another 15 minutes left. So maybe, Danny, if you take the next 5 minutes or so to respond to a selection of the comments. And admittedly, you have been showered with a lot of comments, but which is a very good thing. And we have also had, incidentally, a number of very good questions and comments in the Q&A and the chat box. I will do my best to maybe select one or two, time permitting, to put to you, but the floor is yours, Professor Rodrik.
Thank you very much. Well, that was really a kind of an amazing array of complementary and also, I think, supportive perspectives. So I really want to thank my discussants. I think Ibrahim brought in some very interesting empirical evidence drawing on specific cases. Morocco is indeed an interesting case where we often discuss it as a country that has been successful in terms of integration in global value chains, its auto industry, and sort of. But it often gets lost that actually, if you look at the share of employment in manufacturing in Morocco has been steadily coming down. So it's not immune to this process of employment deindustrialization, despite its successes on the most advanced parts of its manufacturing industry. So it isn't, in many cases, as I think Ibrahim was implying, kind of a paradigmatic case of the problems that I was trying to examine. I was very gratified by Mary's discussion, and she said that it resonated with her own policy experience, and I think I found that very, very reassuring. So I really want to thank you for those comments. And Atif's sort of perspective on a range of complementary policies that would need to be in place, and his emphasis on effective demand management in particular, I think is also very well, very much well worth making. And it is true that in terms of the composition of jobs and the level of jobs, I think effective demand does make a big difference. So I think that's a very, very important emphasis. I guess, I mean, I don't have a lot of, I don't want to take a lot of time either, in case we may want to take one or two questions from the audience. But I mean, the way that I would, put together all these kinds of issues in my mind is that I tend to, when I think about development strategy, I distinguish between what I like to call fundamentals, which are all the kinds of things that are really important to get right in the long term, that without those fundamentals, you're not going to eventually become a well-developed country. And those fundamentals involve everything from your education system, your governance, your regulations, your macroeconomic framework, and so those basically your institutional arrangements and your investments in human capital and governance and so forth. So that is absolutely the essence of development. But so I think keeping those in mind is absolutely critical. You can't take your eyes off those balls when you're thinking about development policy. But there is a second dimension too, which is that while these fundamentals are indispensable for long-term economic development, they are not necessarily what drives very rapid transformation, very rapid growth. Korea or Japan before Korea or Singapore, it's not that they basically invested in fundamentals and then just sat back and waited. Rapid growth was driven by a set of very active policies that were targeted specifically at accelerating structural change, structural transformation. So you need a second track, and often rapid growth is actually accomplished as a consequence of these, what let's call structural change policies or structural transformation policies that produce more rapid structural change in the economy than a strategy of just investment fundamentals would. If you rely on fundamentals, you'll get to structural change eventually, but it's a slow process. It doesn't produce East Asian growth miracles. It doesn't even necessarily produce something that sort of grows at sort of half the rate of what China did or South Korea did. So my comments, sort of, where I would position the remarks that I made, strictly just in that second category. What is it? How is our conception of policies with regard to structural change necessarily changing? And that's really where I want to clarify that I was focusing on these specific cluster of policies that in an earlier era we focused on essentially as basically being almost exclusively or largely driven by industrialization. And I'm just saying that that's not going to do it anymore. And so that's where I think the need for an alternative arises. So with that, kind of a context and large background. So I think let me just stop here.
Okay, great. As I said, we have a lot of questions, and there's no way I can do justice to all these questions in the limited time we have. But let me maybe select a few to put to you, Danny. One question is from Professor Insan Tunali, who sends his greetings from Istanbul, another familiar face in ERF circles. He wonders to what extent the structural challenges in the job markets and changes in technology that you mentioned are not global, and of course not just limited to developing countries. So with that in mind, he's asking if you have some ideas on the number of manufacturing jobs worldwide and how this has been changing over time. And if I may complement that, one of your slides at the beginning where you look at the share of manufacturing value added and also manufacturing employment share, in fact, we see that historically, your data covered 1990 onwards, even at its peak for the countries that you had data, even back in 1990, the maximum share of manufacturing jobs in total was really around 20-25%. So there's this perception that manufacturing offered good jobs, but it has been going down. That trend is very clear, and you've been quite forceful in making that argument. But in total terms, manufacturing still does create jobs if we put aside the shifting composition. And is it still significant in total terms, if considered so?
Thank you for those questions, and I think I'm glad Insan raised the issue, the global dimension of this problem, and I think he is right that it is very much global. But to start with your point, Hassan, sort of it is the level of the peak level of employment in manufacturing that different countries reach historically has been progressively coming down. So I think the earliest industrializers, whether that was Britain, Germany, Northwest Europe, the United States, I think they reached levels of employment that was anywhere between up to a third of total workforce, sometimes close to 40%. But that was sort of, even then, as you say, it wasn't the majority of the workforce, but it was a very large part of the economy. Of course, that also creates a bunch of associated services that are closely linked to that. So I think in that sense, they were the driver. But then some, like South Korea, I think the peak employment level was only 28%. So it was much lower than the earlier wave of industrializers. Today, Vietnam, I think, is only about 12-13% right now, which we think of a country that is doing still well under the industrialization model. I doubt many countries will exceed, 20% for. So we're talking about that peak level coming down, and that's sort of in line with this process of global technological transformation, where manufacturing. The main form in which productivity increases manufacturing is in a labor-saving form, which is, I think, the right way to put it. And I think many of the problems of the advanced countries, the social problems of joblessness in the regions that have been left behind, rising, opioid use, rising rates of suicide among males, breaking up families, the rise of right-wing populism and authoritarianism in many European countries and the United States, they've all been linked in some way to forces of, deindustrialization, good jobs being lost, the China trade shock in the United States, and so forth. So to that extent, in fact, there is very much a kind of a global phenomenon. I think it's for advanced countries, it is a serious phenomenon as well. But advanced countries, at least we expect them to deindustrialize. They've deindustrialized more rapidly. But when you're looking at a country like Ethiopia today, which is unable to industrialize except for through very large, very small scale informal enterprises, and that the large export-oriented firms are not really able to absorb much employment. They're not really growing much in terms of employment. You're finding very low-income countries that in an earlier era ought to have been really industrializing rapidly. They're not managing to achieve. It's much more first order for them. But I agree. I think Insan's point is still that this is a global phenomenon is very important. And if we care about good jobs as much in the advanced countries as we do in the poor countries, which as we should, then we really have to concern ourselves with the direction of technological change globally. And I think that there is a sense in which more labor-friendly technological change or innovations that are more complementary to low or intermediate range of skills as opposed to labor displacing, that in my mind is truly a global public good today. So in just the same way that we thought about investing in high yielding varieties in the post-war period was a kind of a global public good, and that was done through global cooperation and global funding by philanthropies and so forth. I think today there is a genuine argument for putting on the global public good agenda, along with fighting pandemics, along with fighting climate change, rethinking how we finance and how we direct innovation, and doing it so in a way that's actually more friendly through technologies that are complementary to labor. It's not like we don't know how to do those. I think automation in factories can take both large-scale automation, very large, big robots, that is in fact even dangerous for workers to be in the factory. So you have this image of these completely workless factories, or you have so-called cobots, for example, that actually collaborate and work together with labor. So they're much more complementary. So there's a range of innovations that already exist that can be built on, which actually, whether in health services, in education, as well as in manufacturing, where if we had more investment in innovations that work together with humans, that actually would put technological change in it on a trajectory that I think is much more beneficial, both for developing countries where a lot of labor is, and for social inclusion and social conditions in the advanced countries as well. So I do think that this is really ought to be part of the global agenda.
Great. We're really very close to the end time, but I want to raise something which some of our participants have raised on the demographic side. Fertility control has been mentioned as a possibility with a question mark, and also increasing female labor force participation rate, as you know, in our region is low, and projecting forward, if more and more women do, and in fact should be provided with job opportunities, what are your thoughts on the challenges or opportunities that can provide in the context of changing skills, changing the structure of labor market that you have been enlightening us with?
Well, that's another very important dimension where exactly your growth strategy, begins to become more congruent with your, social strategies. That we want women to have the independence and the autonomy and to be able to earn a living and live dignified lives. That's going to happen through better economic opportunities, better job opportunities. So creating, sort of a good job economy is also the way that you accelerate the demographic transition and you empower women. So that's, it's very much the same kind of an agenda.
Excellent. Well, it's precisely 4:30 on my clock, Cairo time. For me in Doha, it's 5:30. And I'm happy to bring this wonderful session, very, very enlightening and stimulating session led by Professor Danny Roderick and enriched by equally diverse, complementary, and fantastic contributions by our three discussants, Professor Atif Kabursi, Dr. Mary Kawar, and Dr. Ibrahim Al-Badawi. We had the excellent number of participants, very active, which is a fitting tribute to the quality and caliber of everybody on this panel. You kept us all on toes, and there was a lot of exchanges, which I hope everybody could read in the Q&A and also in the chat area. My last thanks go to the very able ERF team led by Dr. Shireen Ghonaim, who is somewhere there in the background always. All the good things happen, and we know she's leading the team, gathering together such an amazing international panel and participants. A big thank you to you, Shireen, and the team, and of course, Ibrahim as the Managing Director of ERF. We are very proud and privileged to have this international network of Middle Eastern focused economists, and this is one of the few gems that we have, and we shall endeavor to keep active and alive with everyone's help and contribution. A big thank you to all of you, and all the best, and see you in the upcoming sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.